Chapter 11 of The Romance of Modern Engineering. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Romance of Modern Engineering by Archibald Williams. Chapter 11. The Severn Tunnel. Quote, "The Severn Tunnel, which is a little over 4 miles in length, is by far the most important subaqueous work yet accomplished," end quote. Mr. J. E. Tuitt in The Tower Bridge. In the west of England, the broad Severn estuary offers a serious obstruction to traffic between South Wales and the southwest counties, Cornwall, Devon, Somerset, and Dorset. At Weston-super-Mare, the channel, still several miles broad, makes a sudden turn in a northeast direction to a point some distance beyond Gloucester, thus forming a natural obstacle on the southerly flank of Wales across the main roads from the thickly populated coal fields of Wales to the great metropolis. Thomas Telford, 100 years ago, linked up the turnpike road at Gloucester by a bridge of 100-foot span so that coaches might travel unimpeded, and in 1879 was completed an iron bridge 3/4 of a mile long, which crosses the Severn 26 miles below Gloucester, enabling the midline to Bristol to tap the coal fields of the Forest of Dean, and putting the Great Western also in more direct communication with the same district. Owing to the configuration of the country in the Stroud Valley, the branch of the Great Western that passes through it towards Gloucester is characterized by very severe gradients and sharp curves that detract seriously from speed while adding considerably to the cost of haulage. To avoid this route became the policy of the enterprising directors of the Great Western. They constructed a single line from Bristol to Newpassage, a point a few miles above Portishead and the Avonmouth docks. On the opposite bank, the South Wales Railway terminated near Portscouet, a small agricultural parish. On each bank a large jetty was thrown out, and a steam ferry supplied a means of transporting goods and passengers across the Severn. This, however, was far from satisfactory. The Severn, by presenting a funnel-shaped cul-de-sac to the strong tide running in from the Atlantic, is subjected at spring tides to a rise of 50 feet, rivaling in height that of the Bay of Fundy, and surpassing anything to be witnessed elsewhere in England or on the continent. The strong currents resulting from the sudden rise and fall of the river produce a continual shifting of the sandbanks, most prejudicial to navigation, and render the embarkation at pier heads a troublesome proceeding. The Great Western directors, therefore, thought it would be to the company's interest to incur a further expense to avoid quote-unquote breaking bulk in transshipping passengers. The bold project was set on foot of driving a tunnel under the bed of the Severn from Newpassage to Portscouet, where the river is more than 2 miles wide. The lowest point of the tunnel must necessarily be under the deepest part of the channel, and unfortunately that point was within a few furlongs of the Welsh bank, where the currents have eaten out a depression known as the Chutes, to a depth of some 50 feet below the general level of the bed, so that though the Newpassage end of the tunnel would only be 700 yards from the river edge, the Portscouet face would be 1 3/4 miles inland, in order to preserve an easy gradient of 1 in 100, and at each end it would be necessary to make large cuttings of a maximum depth of 80 to 90 feet, the tunnel itself to have a total length of 4.5 miles. In November 1871, Mr. Charles Richardson deposited plans for the tunnel in Parliament, and in the following year an act was passed for its construction. The Great Western Railway Company at once set to work, after obtaining the services of Sir John Hawkshaw as consulting engineer. Sir John had already gained valuable experience of tunneling in the completion of the East London Railway from Brunel's Thames Tunnel under the London docks through Wapping, Shadwell, and Whitechapel, a work of extreme difficulty. A start was made in 1873 by sinking a shaft, afterwards known as the Old Shaft, 15 feet in diameter and 200 feet deep, on the Monmouthshire side, and lining it with brick. From the bottom of the shaft, a heading, or horizontal excavation, was made riverwards in the line of the tunnel, to act as a drain that should tap the tunnel at its lowest point under the chutes. It had an upward gradient of 1 in 500, and in section was 7 foot square. Matters progressed so slowly, however, through want of a sufficient staff, that by the latter half of 1877, or after 4½ years' work, the company who were carrying on the excavations decided to ask for tenders for the completion of the whole work. 3 estimates were sent in, one by Mr. T. A. Walker, who afterwards took so important a part in the construction of the tunnel. But the estimates being considered excessive, the company decided to continue a heading right under the river, in order to ascertain the nature of the strata to be pierced before going to the contractors. Small contracts were, however, let for the sinking of 1 shaft on the Gloucester side and 2 on the Welch side, known as the Marsh and Hill shafts, and for the driving of horizontal headings both ways from the bottoms of the shafts. The company then completed a 2nd shaft for pumping near Old Shaft, and lined it with iron to within a few feet from the bottom, where it was connected to its neighbor by a short tunnel closed at the iron shaft end by a small trapdoor. On October 18, 1879, an incident took place which marked the date as a black day in the history of the tunnel. In order that the reader may understand clearly what follows, it will be necessary to explain that 40 feet above the drain heading running under the river from the bottom of Old Shaft, headings were being broken in both directions from the same shaft for the traffic tunnel, which at this spot would have risen some distance above its lowest point. Men were working in the western heading when suddenly a large body of water was tapped, and after valiant but vain efforts to stem the tide, the excavators had to fly for their lives. The water, leaping from the heading face a sheer 40 feet to the bottom of the Old Shaft, began to fill up the long sub-river heading, and the men there would have had all means of flight cut off but for the cross tunnel to the iron pit, through which they escaped. In 24 hours' time, the whole of the workings in connection with Old Pit, that is to say, by far the largest portion of the excavations, were full to tide level, and the result of 7 years' labor appeared a melancholy failure. Hitherto the general opinion had been that danger from water, that untiring, wakeful foe of the tunnel driver, was to be apprehended while piercing the strata below the river. But inasmuch as the water that had burst in was fresh and sweet, it became evident that the engineers had to reckon with some subterranean supply fed by the neighboring hills. The directors decided on drastic measures. They appointed Sir John Hawkshaw engineer-in-chief, giving him powers to place a contract with someone whom he might consider to be a fit person to carry out the work. He selected Mr. T. A. Walker. This gentleman had already won his spurs as a railway surveyor and contractor in Canada, Russia, and Egypt, and under Sir John had completed the East London Railway extension referred to above. He now made a contract to finish the tunnel, cuttings, and approaches, a total length of 8 miles 26 chains. the tunnel to carry a double line of rails and be 24 feet high inside from top of arch to lowest point of invert, with a maximum width of 26 feet at the spring of the arch. In signing the agreement, he entered upon an undertaking not to be matched in engineering, unless, perhaps, we accept the driving of the Kilsby Tunnel by Robert Stephenson. A digression for a few lines will be excusable in order to remind the reader of Stephenson's famous feat. When the Northwestern Railway was in course of construction, the promoters proposed to carry it through Nottingham, but the Nottinghamians would have none of the newfangled iron horse, and a detour must be made through the hills near Rugby. Stephenson faced the gigantic task of cutting a tunnel 1 1/3 mile long, after he had, by means of trial shafts, ascertained, as he thought, the exact nature of the strata to be encountered. A contractor was let to build the tunnel for £99,000. Before work had proceeded far, the unfortunate contractor ran against a large waterlogged quicksand. He died soon afterwards, heartbroken, though the company generously waived the terms of the contract. Robert Stephenson stepped into the breach, declaring that he was quite able to master the quicksand by the simple, even if expensive, method of pumping it dry. The pumps threw out water ceaselessly for 9 months at the rate of 1,600 gallons a minute, but without any apparent benefit, until the patience of the directors gave way. They said that to go on flinging good money after bad would be madness. "Give me another fortnight," replied Stephenson, "and if by the end of that time matters are as bad as ever, we must abandon the tunnel." We may imagine the anxiety with which the work was watched. Every hour measurements were taken of the water flowing to the pumps. The end of the fortnight came perilously near, and still no improvement. How poor Stephenson must have despaired inwardly while keeping a brave front to his men. How deep must have been his feelings of gratitude and triumph when at the 11th hour the word went round that the water was not gaining. The quicksand was almost dry, the tunnel was saved, and completed at a cost of £300,000. Mr. Walker at once set about erecting pumps to battle with the Great Spring, as it came to be called, and to clear the flooded workings. Before these could be emptied, it was necessary to block the heading into which the spring had broken at its opening from the old pit. Accordingly, 2 shields were made of the same curvature as the shaft, sufficiently ample to cover the mouths of the headings on either side. Unfortunately, the depth of water from the surface to the headings, 140 feet, produced so great a pressure that divers could not work in it, and it became necessary to lower the water 50 feet to reduce the strain. Great trouble was experienced with the pumps, which gave way first in one part of their mechanism and then in another. But in spite of these untoward incidents, the shields were fixed by the 24th of January, 1880, and made watertight in a few days more. The Great Spring had now been cut off, but water still leaked in at the bottom of the iron pit in greater quantities than the working pumps could cope with, and there was nothing to be done but wait for the arrival of additional pumps. A new 18-foot shaft was put in hand close to the old shaft and over the line of the tunnel to act as a pumping pit. At last a long-expected pump of large capacity arrived and was fitted in the iron pit, which had been cleared to within a few feet of the bottom, when the pump burst with terrific violence, and in an hour or two the shaft was full again. The pump was repaired and replaced by October 14th. On that day, at 11 a.m., began the final struggle with the water. In 24 hours, the water had been lowered 121 feet, enabling a damaged pump to be repaired and brought into action. These 2 pumps, being able to do no more than hold the water that came in from the long sub-river heading, Mr. Walker determined to close, if possible, a door in a head wall that had been built across the heading at a point 1,000 feet from the bottom of Old Shaft. The task was one for a diver, and a brave diver too, to say nothing of the 30-foot head of water giving a pressure of 13 pounds to the square inch. He must walk up the heading, drawing 1,000 foot of hose after him, go through the wall door, close the flap of one sluice, return through the door, make it fast, and screw down a 12-inch sluice in the other side of the wall. A diver named Lambert undertook the job. 3 other divers accompanied him part way to help pass the air hose, the friction of which against the roof of the heading would have been too great for his tractive powers. He set out on his dangerous expedition armed with a short crowbar and groped his way in darkness over the debris, skips, tools, lumps of rocks, until within 100 feet of the door, when the weight of hose prevented farther progress, he was obliged to retrace his steps. 2 days afterwards, Lambert made a second attempt, wearing a fluce dress, which replaces the air hose connection by a cylinder of oxygen carried on the diver's back, but remained under water only half an hour. A third attempt was more successful. Lambert reached the door, but did not close it. The fourth trial, which lasted 80 minutes, resulted in the closing of the door and the sluices. With great anxiety, the floats that told the level were watched after pumping recommenced, but to the disappointment of all, the subsidence amounted at the most to 3 inches an hour, and at high tide to nothing at all. By the 7th of December, however, the use of additional pumps had cleared the iron pit, and the foreman was able to reach the cross wall to which Lambert had made his venturesome and perilous expedition. It was then discovered that the screw-down valve traversing the wall had a left-handed screw, so that Lambert, while closing it down as he thought, was in reality opening it to its full extent. But for this mechanical vagary, the work of pumping would have been a simple matter after the door was closed. The next thing to do was to tackle the western heading, into which the great spring had burst. The door in the shield at its pit end being open, the engineers explored the scene of the inrush. A great quantity of matter had been washed in by the water, partially blocking the heading, and it was therefore decided to keep out the water by building a wall across the heading at a point where the ground appeared firm. This work reached completion in January 1881. For 2 years the spring gave no more trouble. The year 1881 was marked by 3 notable incidents. First came the great snowstorm, still notorious, that worked havoc throughout the British Isles. It cut off communication between the tunnel and the outside world, reducing the contractors to all sorts of shifts to supply their pumping engines with steam, in the absence of a regular supply of coal from South Wales. In May, a strike broke out among the workmen, which for a few days brought the works to a complete standstill, but ended in the men returning to work as before. A month previously, the sea had found an entrance into the Gloucester sub-river heading from a shallow reach called the Salmon Pool. Fortunately for the fate of the tunnel, the long heading from the Sudbrook or Portskewett side had not quite joined that from the Gloucester bank. Otherwise, the water would have poured across the bottom of Old Pit, scouring the whole of the long heading with disastrous effect. At low water, Mr. Walker made a number of men join hands and wade into the Salmon Pool, until the sudden disappearance of one of them for a moment betrayed the whereabouts of the inlet. A schooner load of clay, dumped overboard at the spot, checked further leakage. The remaining months of 1881 and 1882 passed without any serious accidents to delay the work, which proceeded apace. The method employed in making the tunnel was to securely timber the headings. driven at what was to be the bottom level of the completed work, and from them to break up at intervals to the level of the crown of the arch. Each breakup, timbered in turn, became the end of a top heading, 6 feet high and 5 or 6 feet wide, running a few feet above the lower heading for a distance decided by the nature of the ground, technically known as quote-unquote length. The top heading finish groove is cut along the top of each side wall to receive a bulk 12 or more inches in diameter of the same length as the quote length itself. Vertical grooves are then cut in the sides, and into these are inserted props to support the longitudinal bulks. The excavators then dig into the sides farther and cut 2 more horizontal grooves rather farther from the axis of the tunnel, but lower than the first 2 crown bars. Into these, the second pair of crown bars is rolled and similarly secured by uprights, and the operation is continued until the top heading has been widened into the outline of the tunnel arch. The floor has now to be cut away, and a support provided for all the props at the end of the crown bars. A deep groove is therefore sunk across the heading to a point a little lower than the inferior ends of the props, and a massive beam, 12 to 15 inches square, let into it. A second set of props is then wedged between the sills, as the cross beams are called, and the crown bars. The lower heading is then widened and sills fixed top and bottom, separated by tightly jammed props. And then, the matter between the 2 headings being removed, a middle tier of props set between the bottom sill of the top heading and the top sill of the lower heading. If, then, the reader imagines himself to be in a length timbered ready for masonry, he will see overhead a number of horizontal and parallel balks, reaching from the highest point of the arch down each side of the tunnel to within a few feet of the bottom. Each end of the length is shut in by 2 tiers of short upright beams bearing sills, and above these again rises a third fan-shaped tier of supports taking directly the weight of the crown bars. The invert or concave tunnel bottom is then bricked, and after it the 2 sides to the spring of the arch. It now is time to set the centers, semicircular wooden frames, across the arch parallel to one another at a distance of 3 or 4 feet, and line them on their inner and outer sides with stout boards. They act as a support over which the masons can lay their bricks. Sometimes the arch is built inside the crown bars, sometimes outside them, and sometimes between them, the bars being withdrawn horizontally in turn to make room for the bricks. As soon as a length is completed, the excavators drive top headings from each end, removing the debris and bringing in timber and lining materials through the bottom heading, which acts as a common feeder to a succession of breakups, each of which has 2 working faces. This system enables the work to be pushed forward rapidly, as in the confined space of a tunnel only a limited number of men can be advantageously employed on one face, and a great economy of time results when heading, driving, chambering, timbering, and lining are in simultaneous progress at different points. The care exercised by foremen and miners is evident from the fact that out of the 1,500 lengths taken out, in only 1 was the timbering unequal to the strain placed upon it by the superincumbent mass. The strata encountered were of many kinds, starting from the Welsh bank, alluvium, sand, white sandstone, marl, conglomerate, millstone grit, coal shale, blue shale, clay shale, red sandstone, gray sandstone, marl, and gravel. In some places, pick and shovel work was able to cope with the strata, but in many, rock drills and blasting became necessary. When a large number of breakups were in operation, the amount of material to be transported to and from the working faces became so great that in the Gloucester half of the long heading, Mr. Walker laid down a double line of rails, between which worked a continuous steel rope, actuated by an engine at the top of sea-wall shaft. The rope, or bond, was carried by horizontal rollers placed on the sleepers of the road a few feet apart. When the engine was started, the rope traveled at a uniform speed of 2 miles an hour round a large pulley situated rather more than a mile from the foot of the shaft. Men called hookers-on attached full skips to the rope, flanking the up line, or detached empty ones from the down line rope. At the shaft bottom the skips were placed in cages, and after being hoisted, discharged, and lowered again, returned for another load. The system worked so smoothly that at times as many as 200 skips were in motion at once, and the cost was reduced to a fraction of that of the pony haulage employed at the Welsh end. The reader must bear in mind that in the early 80s the engineer was not nearly so well equipped as he is today. Electric lighting, for instance, was still in its infancy, and not only were candles largely used in the workings of the Severn tunnel, but those electric lamps installed gave a considerable amount of trouble, and only a very inadequate amount of light according to present ideas. Rock boring machinery also was not nearly so perfect as it is today, and explosives not so effective. And not until 1882 was the telephone established in the works. Mr. Walker considers that on the very first day of its installment it averted a strike, since a ganger in the cabin at one end of the wires overheard a man saying mutinous things in the other cabin, and by dismissing him prevented further mischief. The mining engineer is now able to apply electricity in many other ways that were unknown at that time. And last but not least, the pneumatic shield for penetrating waterlogged strata has since then become a much more efficient machine. On the 2nd of December, a curious panic seized the workmen in the long heading under the river. Mr. Walker found about 300 to 400 men at the top of the main Sudbrook shaft, all breathless and excited, some partly naked. On inquiring what was the matter, he was told that the river had broken in, but nobody appeared to be able to give any definite statement as to where it had burst through. There was no more water than usual in the pumping pit, and its color was unchanged. Accordingly, Mr. Walker and 2 foremen descended the shaft and found the heading perfectly dry, except for the ordinary drainage from small leaks. In several places, hats, kerchiefs, waistcoats, and leggings strewed the floor of the workings, marks of a hurried flight. It afterwards turned out that some water, imprisoned by an obstruction in a heading on the Gloucester side, had, on the removal of the obstacle, flowed down the long heading and topped the edge of a chute that carried any leakage. The men at the Welsh end, not knowing the cause of this sudden increase in the flow, acted on a miner's advice to fly for their lives, rushing to the Sudbrook winding shaft. When passing through links of finished tunnel, says Mr. Walker, they spread out in a disorderly crowd, running perhaps 20 feet wide. Then they would come to a short length between 2 breakups, where there was only a 7-foot heading. Here they threw each other down, trampled upon each other, shouting and screaming, and then to add to the disorder, the ponies in the various breakups took the alarm and galloped down in the direction of the winding shaft, trampling on the prostrate bodies of the men. When the men reached the top of the pit, the night shift, which would go below at 2 o'clock, had already received their pay and were gathering ready to descend. It may be imagined that these men cruelly chaffed the others who had come up as soon as it was known that there was no danger below, and I have reason to think they reaped quite a harvest of neckties and other things thrown away by the others when they went down to their work. Thus ended an incident which, comical enough in itself, must have given the men concerned, no more than the contractor, a very bad quarter of an hour. Real troubles were about to occur again. At the close of May 1883, an attempt was made to open the door in the wall keeping out the great spring, but the debris behind rendered all efforts vain, and eventually a hole a foot in diameter had to be bored through the door with augers, and through this hole the men tried to clear away the impediment. This method proving impracticable, a heading was driven below the blocked heading, and a break-up made to allow the water to pass that way and permit an examination of the upper heading. The men found that the roof had fallen in for a length of 50 to 60 feet, and that there was an enormous cavity overhead. An inclined heading was therefore driven from the top heading into the cavity, and quantities of timber and other materials thrown into it to protect the bottom heading. 3 new doors were then built, one in each of the 3 headings, as a precaution against further eruptions of water. But the great spring had only been scotched. On October 10, 1883, the unwelcome news reached Mr. Walker that it was pouring into the lower heading in a larger volume than had yet been met with. He found, on descending the shaft, a river of 16 feet wide and 3 feet 6 inches deep, roaring down the 40-foot drop to the bottom of the shaft. The heading door could not be closed. The pumps could not check the inflow, and in a short time the men in the long heading were making for the Welsh shore. The next day 52 feet of water stood in the works. The services of Lambert were again requisitioned, and this intrepid diver managed to close the door through which the water flowed. By November 3rd, the tunnel was again freed of water and the great spring in check. As though the lot of the engineers and contractors had not yet been sufficiently hard, the sea next showed its malice. The shore on the Welsh side is at the water's edge, the site of the old, iron, and new shafts, considerably above the high tide level. But farther inland there are flat, low-lying marshes, once fertile meadowland protected by a seawall, liable to be swept by spring tides. In the center of the marshes, the marsh shaft had been sunk. On October 17, 1883, the night shift had descended to their work in the headings opening from this shaft. It was a tempestuous night, the wind blowing southwest, and an unusually high tide was known to be due. Previously, no tide had ever reached the site of the shaft, and there appeared to be no reason for anxiety. But the wind working with the tide, as it did in November 1897 on the East Coast, piled up the waters in the Severn estuary to an alarming height. A great tidal wave, advancing in a solid wall, burst over the marshes. Some houses belonging to tin plate works were invaded by the flood to a depth of 5 or 6 feet, and the children had to be placed for safety on piled tables or shelves. The wave next attacked the pumping station and extinguished the fires. Then, meeting the shaft, it roared down a fall of 100 feet. What must have been the feelings of the unhappy miners below? A few managed to climb the ladders and escape, but one poor fellow, when halfway up, was torn off by the violence of the water and hurled into the gulf below. There remained 83 men in the shaft. As the water rose, they retreated farther up the gradient, waiting for the end. Meanwhile, others, at the ground level, were making desperate efforts to form a circular dam round the mouth of the shaft. Sacks, timber, and even clothing were used. Fortunately, the first fury of the tide was soon expended. The dam served its purpose, and preparations were made for going below with a small boat to explore the tunnel. At the bottom of the shaft, the water had risen to within 8 feet of the tunnel crown. The men were finally rescued from the breakup in which they had taken refuge and brought safely to the top. Had the tide been a few inches higher, it is probable that not one would have survived the catastrophe. The position of affairs was now indeed lamentable. Flooded headings, flooded cuttings, and a spring of unknown copiousness to reckon with. The clearing of the sea water was only a matter of time, and the workings were soon emptied, but the delays, meaning extra wages, the continually recurring need for new pumps and engines to meet some fresh catastrophe, and the huge bill for fuel had already put the contractor £100,000 out of pocket. Still, he must persevere with his arduous and wearing task. The tunnel must be finished, even if it ruined him. To the big spring, Sir John Hawkshaw and Mr. Walker now turned their earnest attention. As a preliminary to underground operations, the bed of the small river Netterne, suspected of feeding the spring, was lined with a concrete invert for nearly 4 miles. A heading was then driven parallel to the center line of the tunnel, but 40 feet to the north of it, so as to drain the spring from the flank and leave the site of the tunnel dry. The plan succeeded so well that it was possible to push on the top heading towards that running from the next shaft, and October 17th, a way lay clear from one end of the tunnel to the other. The chambering out of the spring length was, however, a difficult business, as small fissures crossed the line here and there. But at last the masons completed their work and the tunnel lining was finished. On September 5, 1885, a train passed through the tunnel from end to end, carrying the chairman of the Great Western Railway and a party of friends. Mr. Walker shortly afterwards quitted the scene of his labors for South America, where other work awaited him. His old enemy soon called him back. The great spring was giving trouble, squeezing the tunnel lining with such force that bricks flew from their settings. In order to relieve the pressure, it was decided to erect a pumping station for permanent use. Every day, water to the average amount of 24 million gallons is emptied by the pumps into the Severn, a supply sufficient, as Mr. Walker has calculated, to form annually a lake 1,000 acres in extent and 30 feet deep. The passenger whose lot it is to be plunged for some minutes into the darkness of the Severn tunnel will, after reading these lines, be able better to appreciate the magnitude of the work needed to make his swift passage a possibility. Here are a few points for him specially to ponder upon. That the construction of the tunnel occupied 14 years and consumed over 77 million bricks. That the water pumped out during those years represent a lake 3 miles square and 30 feet deep. That though the working was conducted from more than 40 breakups, the calculations were made so accurately that when the sections joined, no deviation from absolute straightness in the 2 3/4 miles of straight tunnel could be detected by instruments. Among submarine tunnels, the Severn holds first place on the score of difficulty in construction. Mr. Walker himself confesses in his book that one such tunnel was sufficient for a lifetime. End of chapter 11.